Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another incredible episode jam-packed with interesting discussions, so hopefully you enjoy today's episode. And the first topic we're going to talk about, I know some people get a little agitated or a little annoyed when I bring up this topic, but it's the main news item that's probably going to be the main news item for a very long time, and that is the 2024 election. And particularly the Republican primary battle that's brewing between Trump versus DeSantis. I know that I've covered this topic a lot, but there's always just so many new developments, and there were a ton of new developments last week. Even wrote a very highly respected article last week on this topic on DeSantis' new strategy, and DeSantis is now openly attacking Trump, which is not very wise, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Trump had a rally last weekend in Waco, Texas, and it was simply epic. I mean, as I've pointed this out, I was very skeptical about Trump back in December and November when he first announced. It didn't seem like he was running. Didn't seem like he had his old energy. He was doing his NFTs, which were actually very funny. But at the same time, they're like, this is not what we're voting for your very great content NFTs. We are voting for something else. We want the president to address other topics. But he's been doing that at all his rallies. His rallies have been very strong, and the messaging he's been delivering is exactly what we want. All the news media is talking about, Trump is talking about the election in apocalyptic terms. He's talking about how evil the liberals and the Biden administration are, about how they're trying to put him in jail over his alleged misdeeds and all this other alleged misconduct that he's had. And he's really shaping up a message for the base that pretty much most of right-wing Twitter wants. They want a president who's going to be... They want that apocalyptic message. The only people who don't want that apocalyptic message are the mainstream media. And he's the only candidate delivering it. So, some highlights from it. He made fun of DeSantis. That's always a highlight. He talked about how, the deep state, we must either destroy the deep state or the deep state is going to destroy America. Exactly what we want to hear. He once again keeps bringing up how we're going to have a mass deportation program. Only Republican bringing up this subject, which is very important because we have so many illegal aliens pouring into the country under Biden that we have to figure out a way that they're not going to stay here forever, and only Trump is offering a solution more than secure the border. He wants them to be deported, which is what should happen to send a message to future illegals that you will not find a permanent toehold here. You will not be allowed to stay in America, and only Trump is delivering that message, and it's resonating with a lot of the public. And I think his most important thing he was saying is he is emphasizing that the problem is not with China or Russia or a foreign threat. It's with our own politicians, which is something that the right has been saying for a long time, the genuine right. And we now have a presidential candidate saying that. And it's very radical that a presidential candidate is saying that. Very rare for a president to say the problem is within America, which is, Greer had talking point, but not unique to Scott M. Greer saying this. But we finally have a presidential candidate saying this. Most of the time you'll say, like, the real threat is China, the real threat is Russia, or the real threat is radical Islam. All these problems. Except for really Russia. I think we've made that a bigger problem than it should be. But, China and radical Islam are problems. But the real threat, the real thing destroying our nation, the real thing transforming our country into something that we don't recognize and we don't feel, and we feel alien to our beings, is something within. It's something internal. And Trump is highlighting that. And, people are very disturbed by this. Like, this is unpatriotic. This is disloyal. This is treasonous even. And Trump is just like, we're going to go along with it, and we're going to stand up for the American people, what they represent. So it's an awesome message he's delivering. I don't think you couldn't ask for a better messaging from a candidate. And it's not like me just shilling. Some people are going to roll their eyes as like, he's just shilling. All these DeSantis supporters are claiming every Trump supporter is getting paid. I'm not getting paid by anyone. I am simply stating the facts. And And you compare this messaging to any other candidate, and it's just miles ahead of them. It blows them out of the water. Like, there's no comparison to this. There's no milquetoast, lawyerly discourse that leaves what he's saying open to interpretation. He's direct, he's clear about what he's saying, and he's moving the Overton window in the necessary direction. Now, everyone's going to just say, like, well, he says this rhetoric, but can he actually do this? It's like, well, compared to like any other Republican, would he do less or more? He's more likely to do more, and he's the only one stating this message, and it indicates that he's the only one to act on these messages. And DeSantis is just, trying to sit on the fence and trying to be open to interpretation and gain support from both neocons and some of the populists, and he's trying to be whatever they want him to say he's believing in, which Trump is not. Trump is very direct and clear about what he says, and that offends some people, but it obviously draws the base even closer towards him. And this is reflected in polls. A lot of the polls are now showing that Trump has 50% support. It was declining a lot in the fall and the winter, but now it's back to what it was prior to the midterms. He has a strong double-digit lead over DeSantis, and DeSantis' support is slipping in recent polls. And it's not hard to see why. DeSantis, we talked about Trump, but now we'll get on to DeSantis, which I discussed a little bit in an article last week. He is now going with a strategy that is being egged on by his online supporters. His online supporters think that Trump is weak, that Trump is ready to be taken down, and that he just needs to be called a loser. And maybe they'll even bring up his tiny hands again, or all these type of insults that conservative and never Trumpers were loved back in 2016. And this is getting to DeSantis' head. And DeSantis is clearly trying to run, and he's trying to differentiate himself. The big Trump story that we talked a little bit about in the IQ supplement last week, or not the IQ supplement, the regular episode, is the Trump's looming indictment, which is coming from the Manhattan DA, and he's got a lot of other federal or legal troubles. He's got investigation going on in Georgia relating to his election challenge there. He's got the federal investigations that concern his handling the documents that he allegedly mishandled, and also his relation to if there's any type of illegal activity he did with January 6th. And so he's got a lot of those legal questions hanging over him. And last week, there was the indictment. Everyone thought it was going to drop on Tuesday, but for whatever reason, the Manhattan DA has been backing off. Now, it might be because there's liberal backlash saying, like, this is a weak case, this is going to help Trump, do not do this. And maybe the Manhattan DA is getting cold feet, or maybe there's so much pressure from Trump or others that, it's diminishing the case. So Trump has obviously not been indicted yet. So maybe maybe Manhattan DA is waiting to make it a more solid case, or he's getting cold feet about doing the whole process. That's something that we'll have to look into this week if it happens this week. And Trump, it seems to, according to reports, wants to be arrested because he'll, portray himself as a martyr to his base, and that'll increase his support, which is true. He is going to be the martyr to the base, and the Republican Party is going to rally behind him, and his support is going to go up. And when the FBI raided his property at Mar-a-Lago last year, his support went up to nearly 60%. And you'll probably see at least a 5 to 10% bump among the polls when he gets indicted. And this is such a weak case that I don't think it's going to hurt him at all in the Republican primaries. And so the proper response to this for Republicans is to rally behind him, talk about this political persecution. This is just showing how Democrats are weaponizing, legal and state and local power to go after their political enemies. And this is the real thing to drive home. And some candidates are doing that. I've been critical of Vivek Ramaswamy, but he had the best response from another candidate to Trump's possible indictment, saying that this is a weaponization of state power against Democrats weaponizing state power against their political enemies. This is un-American. This is against the Constitution. It's a strong stance. A strong stance was not offered by Ron DeSantis, who gave a very passive-aggressive reply where he's like, I don't know about paying porn stars. Like, I don't know what the deal with that is. And, his little cronies behind him are laughing. And he's like, we're not going to get involved in Florida. We're focused on important issues like kowtowing to my wife who's always standing over my shoulder. And this is how we do it in Florida. And so this is... So DeSantis gave the worst possible message, and there was a lot of backlash to it because they're like, he's simply saying this is unimportant. I'm going to focus on, I'm not going to get involved in this. And he then made fun of Trump, and that's Trump gave a very a keck message about how DeSantis may have his own problems, being accused of having false allegations, maybe even from a man. And so implying that DeSantis might be gay, I don't know the truth about that, but it's funny anyway. And Trump knows how to bully his subjects, and DeSantis, all they can do is just whine on Twitter about this. But DeSantis had other problems last week. He also backtracked from his Ukraine stance, which is, for the listeners who listened, who tuned in for my IQ supplement on, the Ukraine stances from all the Republican presidential candidates 2 weeks ago. I would say that DeSantis, he's saying interesting things, but it's like not a vital national security interest, but it was like so ambiguous and not clear and direct about what he wanted. Trump outlined clear and direct policy proposals. He said we'd have a peace deal in 24 hours. We would, if a peace deal is reached, we would no longer be funding Ukraine. We're the only way we'd start funding Ukraine is if Russia violates that peace agreement. And we're definitely not going to pursue regime change in Russia because the real regime change we need to do is here in the United States of America. Very clear cut. DeSantis, besides saying, it's not a vital national interest, it's just a territorial dispute in Russia's sphere. He didn't even say Russia's sphere, Eastern Europe. He basically offered what is already Biden's doing. It's like, we're not going to offer F-16s or fighter jets or the latest military technology that Ukraine has been requesting and Biden has been denying. He's restating Biden's position, but in a way that appears that it's more non-interventionist. He didn't talk about cutting off funds for Ukraine. He didn't give a timetable for that. Wasn't even clear about regime change in Russia. He did not give clear, direct answers. It was lawyerly speak that is open to interpretation. But the problem is the interpretation came that he simply just doesn't care about, he's pro-Russia, and he's unsympathetic to Ukraine. So last week, he had to do damage control, and he said that Putin is a war criminal, and he runs Russia as just a gas station with nuclear weapons. And he was giving a very harder line on Russia, but he's like, well, it's just not that important. And then he reemphasizes, his only policy proposals are the same as Biden's, is that we're not going to give the most advanced technology, war technology to Ukraine, which we're already doing. And this statement left it open to interpretation. Like, his big, DeSantis shills were talking about how he's the true non-interventionist. Like, this is way better than anything Trump would say, which is just not true. And they're like saying he's the real realist foreign policy, which is just not that. But then the neocons who support him also said that like DeSantis did the right move backtracking and emphasized that he stands with Ukraine and he supports them and he realizes that Russia is an enemy. So depending on your perspective, it's open to whatever you want him to believe. And maybe that's a smart politician move, but I don't think the base is going to want that. It's like, it's hard to pin him down on what he actually believes. It's like he gives these statements that are open to multiple interpretations. And then when you try to find the policy in it, it's, the same as Biden's. It's just, he's just couching in a different language. And that's what he's doing here with Ukraine. And he realizes he has to do this because, his donors and a lot of that institutional support that he depends on to run his presidential campaign, because he's not a dynamic, charismatic figure, as I always say. He's not going to be running a populist candidacy against Donald Trump himself. He has to depend on that institutional support. And they were upset about his Ukraine comments, so he had to do a backtrack. And it looks weak on his part, but I guess it satisfied some of the donors to an extent. But a lot of these donors are not even happy about it. I mean, there was a pretty credible report that came out last week saying that a lot of these donors and institutional allies are, becoming more lukewarm to a prospect about DeSantis. They are realizing he's not the guy, that he does not have the goods that have been promised by conservative media. and they're seeing his missteps on Ukraine. They're seeing his missteps on responding to the possible Trump indictment, and they're realizing that this guy is not the person. And even some of his ardent supporters are realizing that he's got problems. I mean, I cited this article in my piece last week on DeSantis going with the Marco Rubio strategy, and it came from Ben Domenech. And Domenech was pointing out, like, he went all about how Trump sucks and blah, 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 and how awesome DeSantis is. But then he's like, well, DeSantis can't allow himself to get bullied throughout a presidential campaign because the base is just going to see him was weak. He has to return fire with fire. He has to fight fire with fire here. And he's got to bully Trump back, and he's got to call him a loser, which is just a terrible strategy in and of itself. It's the Marco Rubio strategy, and it appears he wants to do this because he began attacking Trump at his Piers Morgan interview and yakking it up with Piers Morgan about, like, I don't know how to spell the sanctimonious, but you just need to know I'm a winner, which he only won in 2018 due to Trump's support. So he wants to go with this Marco Rubio strategy that Rubio and others did back in 2016, where they're like, you have to take on Trump. You have to get down in the dirt with him. And what Marco Rubio did is he began making fun of Trump's hand size, which Rick Wilson and all these other never-Trumpers were obsessed with how Mr. Tiny Hands Trump, Tiny Hands is not well remembered now, but it was back then. That's all conservatives talked about, as Mr. Tiny Hands Trump. And Trump, it was a way to make fun of the size of another member of his body. Let's say that. And Rubio even implied that in some of his speeches. But he finally did the Tiny Hands thing in late February. It was after the South Carolina primary, so it was right before Super Tuesday primaries. And did this even in a debate stage, and he was talking about his hand size, and it's he's going, and all these conservatives whoa, he finally went there. This is awesome. Rubio just destroyed Trump. And then at the debate stage, Trump's he makes fun of my hand size. Look at him. There's nothing wrong there. And he may imply that there's something wrong elsewhere, but let me tell you, there's nothing wrong down there. And then at the debate, they're okay, because he clearly talked about the size of his penis, and he embarrassed Rubio for even implying that. And Rubio was ashamed that he had even brought that up. It's very awkward that he brought it up, and he got destroyed in the Super Tuesday primaries, and he soon after dropped out after losing Florida to Trump. And so it was an embarrassment. So it never worked for DeSantis, or never worked for Rubio. Gonna get Rubio and DeSantis mixed up. But Rubio, he was very robotic, but he could give a good stump speech. He was not awkward. He was always confident. He could deliver the lines he needed to. He rehearsed them. Yes, there was a level of inauthenticity to what he said, and he could speak off the cuff, and he was very confident in himself. DeSantis is not confident. He is awkward. If he's not in a comfortable position where he's got his little cronies behind him and his wife leering over him, and he's in a safe environment where the reporters throw up an easy slam dunk for him, he's very awkward, and he loses his cool, and not even really losing his cool, because that's implying he's getting angry, but he just looks off. And even on debate stages, he looks bad. I mean, when he was going up against Charlie Crist, Crist was an unlikable person, but Crist was looking better in the debates. And DeSantis, they even asked about a presidential. He's the only donkey I'm worrying about beating is the one on this stage. And it's they're this is so epic. Heavy D brings the fire. And it's just so much awkward things. If Trump, or even one of the more charismatic figures, even Vivek Ramaswamy, would probably destroy DeSantis on a debate stage, because they realize he's very awkward and it's very easy to make him look off-kiltered. Far more so than Rubio. Rubio was able to maintain cool, calm, and stay the thing. Even though he got exposed for having robotic, rehearsed lines, he still delivered them far better than DeSantis. And DeSantis has even less charisma than Rubio. And there was less support, much more skepticism of Trump back in 2016, and Rubio was never able to overcome it. Cruz even went into there too, but Cruz got outbullied by these guys. And I have to, to bring it back to the overall point is that I'm seeing it from what's on Twitter and what a lot of the conservative media wants is that they want to have a replay of 2016, but they'll think this time will be different, that it will defeat Trump. And I want to take, some of our listeners probably don't remember the 2015 and 2016 that well. They may not have been involved in politics at the time. They may have even been in high school or middle school at the time. There's some younger Zoomers out there who maybe were too young to be really involved in it. But, taking it back to 2015, when I go on Twitter and I see these DeSantis shills, like, shrieking about Trump, like, jilted ex-lovers, and then them getting a lot of engagement and them high-fiving themselves that they've destroyed Trump with this latest tweet, even though Trump's numbers continue to rise, it reminds me it's the exact replica of what 2016 was like. 2015 to 2016, anytime I'd log onto Twitter, I'd see some big conservative account being like, Trump is not a conservative. He's a tiny hands loser. And they get engagement and all these big accounts would be quote tweeting and be like, this is so true. Trump is done. And then anytime they talk about how Trump is done, it's like, Trump said this. He alienated the base. It's like Trump is outrageous. And they would just get so angry at Trump and be like, there's no way he's going to win. He's going to lose like a loser he is. And now you're seeing all that rhetoric being replicated again in 2023, likely going to extend in 2024, when the circumstances are far more favorable to Trump. When Trump first came down the escalator, Republican voters were very skeptical. And Republican voters were always very skeptical. I mean, for most of the race in 2015, his numbers never went into the 30%. There seemed to be a ceiling for Trump right around 28, 29%, at most 30%. But then when he suggested the Muslim ban in December of 2015, he then finally went into the 30s. But then they were like, there's still a ceiling of like 34, 33%. And there was still a lot of Republican skepticism. They're like, well, I like what he's saying. He's really connecting what I care about. But, it's Donald Trump. I'm not going to vote for him. And eventually people came around to it more about voting for Trump. Fast forward 7 years later. It's how that time flies by when you're being based. Or being keyed, rather. And he now, the Republican voters have voted for Trump twice. They have grown much more connected to Trump. Their qualms and concerns about Trump that they had in 2015 and 2016 are mostly gone. There's still people with issues about Trump. They still may want a new candidate. They may, maybe they want the Republican Party to move on to something new. But they still like Trump a lot more than they did in 2015 and 2016, where there was a lot of reluctance to, vote for Trump. But now these people have voted for Trump twice. They don't have that reluctance anymore. And now that base of support, that ceiling of support that Trump had is much higher, way higher. I mean, 90, during his presidency, he always had over 90% of Republican approval, like one of the highest party approval ratings of any president in modern history. The approval rating for the rest of the public was a little bit lower, obviously, but his approval rating among Republicans was the highest for any president, and their own respective party was higher than anybody in modern history. They were firmly attached to him, and that support is still there. Favorability ratings, they're a little bit lower now, but they're roughly around 70. I think they'll be up to 70% at least in the next few months, and they'll probably rise even higher. And that favorability rating was not there during the primaries. I mean, the favorability rating was, I don't think it ever exceeded 50% until he started winning primary races. And it probably, even by the time that Rubio started attacking him, I think it was under 50%, his favorability rating. But he still overcame those challenges and fought through them. Now DeSantis, far less charismatic than any person in the Republican race. Even Jeb Bush probably had a little bit more charisma than DeSantis. DeSantis just says what the base wants more than Jeb Bush. And certainly Ted Cruz and Rubio have more charisma and were far smarter on their feet, better on their feet than DeSantis is. And we're never awkward, and we're always very confident in how they presented themselves. And even with this Cruz, who had an unlikability factor, very much like Richard Nixon, he was still able to positively convey himself by just being very confident in what he said, having a degree of charisma, being, smart on his feet, and being able to message and convey what he wanted to say effectively. DeSantis does not have that advantage. And he also has the disadvantage of being Trump, being far more liked by Republican voters. And even when Republican voters may want someone else, maybe even if they want DeSantis or whoever, they still like Trump, and they do not like the political prosecution of Trump. And so you'll talk to people who are like, well, I'm ready to move on to DeSantis, but I really don't like how they're prosecuting Trump and going after him over nothing. And if they see DeSantis of making light of it and making fun of him, they're going to be like, well, you know what? I don't think DeSantis understands the importance of this. I don't think DeSantis understands how the left is going after its political enemies. I think DeSantis is a little bit too gleeful about this indictment going up against Trump and how it may help DeSantis. And so maybe I'll second guess my support for DeSantis. Maybe I'll go back to Trump. Or maybe I'll go to another candidate who actually better expresses my beliefs and my opinions and better connects with me than DeSantis. And these are real world people. On Twitter, it's completely different. It's the same in 2015 and 2016. 2015 and 2016, all these never Trumpers were saying that Trump has no real support. It's all bots. Everyone I know hates Trump, and they would just be so out of control in their vitriol against Trump. Every day, it was these guys shrieking at their computer monitors and laptops and smartphones about how much they hated Trump. And you see that among a much smaller demographic of DeSantis shows, because a lot of conservatives who have a little bit longer memory realize that it was a bad PR for them to go with this. Even though National Review is now returning to this mode, they're saying Trump is not a conservative, and they're this is an effective messaging, and they're expecting CNN or whoever mainstream media to be wow, National Review is attacking Trump. This isn't fucking news. This is all they did back in 2016, and it didn't work. I mean, they did a whole issue against Trump with a bunch of conservative pundits who were there, and a lot of these people became just libtards afterwards, or they became Trump supporters after doing this magazine. It had no effect whatsoever, their opposition. But now they think conservative media's opposition could matter more, because on Twitter, people on Twitter are more likely to support DeSantis than in real life. The average Republican voter is not on Twitter. They're on Facebook. They're on the old people platforms, or if they're on social media at all. And they get their news from talk radio and Fox News. And talk radio is still very pro-Trump. Very few of the big talk radio hosts are going into this neo-never Trumpism. Mark Levin is very pro-Trump. Sean Hannity is very pro-Trump. Rush Limbaugh, of course, is no longer around, but even the replacements for him all make sure to be very pro-Trump. And this was a big case that helped Trump in 2015 or 2016. Or rather, didn't help him, is that talk radio realized that their listeners love Trump, and they did not want to antagonize and alienate them. And those who have to depend on interacting with that real audience emphasize they still like Trump. They're still supporting him during his political persecutions, and standing by him. Even maybe they may be not as committed to supporting Trump, but they still need to make sure that they're pro-Trump. Like Tucker, recent text messages coming out of him complaining about Trump, in the aftermath of the election. He came out and said, I love Trump. These are taken out of context. I stand with him, and his program is not engaging in neo-never Trumpism. It's talking about the Alvin Bragg, how bad he is, and about FBI investigations are outrageous, and it's standing with Trump. It's not reflecting what Twitter is, because all cable news show hosts and talk radio actually have to interact with real world Trump, with real world conservatives, with the actual base, and they still like Trump. But on Twitter, where it's a little bit different demographic, there people are I'm tired of Trump, the Platinum Plan, that's outrageous. The only people who give a fuck about the Platinum Plan are on Twitter. Nobody cares about the Platinum Plan. I'm tired of it. Yes, it was a stupid idea, but it had no impact on the election. No impact whatsoever. It didn't sway any black voters, but more importantly, as everyone wants to point out, that it apparently alienated the white working class. It did not alienate a single damn voter. Doesn't matter. The only people who care about this are on Twitter. It's the same with the alt-right complaining about Trump throughout his presidency about the fucking Syrian strikes. The Syrian strikes were on empty fucking airfields. They didn't matter. But people were like, this is how we should have separated ourselves. And look at all those people separated from themselves. They're completely irrelevant and out of the political picture. Like, the alt-right is dead. Like, the remnants are not even there. And even like the remnants that are still alive are now working with liberals, are saying they're liberals, and because they separate themselves from the MAGA movement. That was what the real base, the right-wing base of America was around. And they separated themselves and turned hostile to it, and they're out of the political picture. Like, they no longer matter. And the same way, from a different angle, as Never Trumpers. Is like a lot of these hardcore Never Trumpers had to just leave conservatism in general, like David French, Bill Kristol, David Frum had already really left conservatism, but there's so many of these guys who just like switched over to being liberals because there was no place for them for this really over-the-top hostility to Trump that on conservatism is like the whole conservative base liked Trump, and they didn't want to hear these diatribes against Trump 24/7. And there's still some people who remain within the conservative fold, but are still anti-Trump, Jonah Goldberg, but they had to tone down their criticisms. But now these people are just like going back to their 2016 selves, their Never Trumper selves, and thinking this time will be different. But it's going to be the same replay. It's even more guaranteed this time. The only way that a presidential candidate not named Donald Trump can get the Republican nomination is if Trump drops out. If Trump stays in, he wins the nomination, no matter his legal problems. There's nothing new going to come out. Like, Republican voters are already aware of Stormy Daniels. They're already aware of some of, like, maybe his business deals and stuff. They're very aware of January 6th. They don't care. They don't care. Now, general election voters, that's a different matter. But for when it comes to Republican primary voters, they don't care. And then trying to mock and attack Trump is just going to antagonize those people and make them more likely to support Trump. And that's just something that conservatives won't understand. It's the same, they went through the same tactics in 2016. Like, all this shit is the same. Like, his interactions with porn stars, even the Access Hollywood tape, even though that happened in the general election. Like, all these attacks are the same. They're just warming them up. They've been in the refrigerator for 7 years, and they're pulling them out. They think these leftovers are now going to work, as they're old and moldy the audience is completely different, has a completely different view of Trump. It's just not going to work. So this is a major problem for other candidates, is that the only way they can win is if Trump drops out. And not only that he drops out, but he's supportive of that candidate. Maybe he won't directly endorse somebody, but he won't directly attack that person. Now, let's say Trump drops out. He's never going to support DeSantis. DeSantis has, sunk his chance of ever getting Trump support, at least in 2024. Probably going to be even into 2028. But, Trump is never going to support DeSantis. He will support whoever is not named DeSantis, because he sees this person as somebody who's not defending him, as somebody who's eager for him to get out of the race and eager even for him to be arrested. And so he's not going to support him. The person who's being smart about this is Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek is being very supportive of Trump, making sure not to attack him, and being like, this is, we've got to stand with Trump. Because Vivek realizes the only way he can win is if two things: Trump drops out and Trump is supportive of his candidacy. And Vivek is more likely to get Trump support than DeSantis. And Vivek, I've kind of discounted his presidential aspirations. But, let's say Trump did drop out. And, Vivek is still in the race. And Trump, maybe doesn't do a full endorsement, but he talks about how much he likes Vivek. And Vivek is far more charismatic than anyone else on the Republican field besides Trump. If you watch his interview, there's a reason that cable news, like CNBC and Fox News, like to have him on. He's very good on TV. And he gives a good speech, even though he's like a short little Indian, and maybe, and I don't think the average Republican voter can pronounce his name. He is far more dynamic and charismatic than DeSantis. And he has even a more interesting message. Now, I do have to have some, clarifications here. I would still probably not vote for Ramaswamy, but even coming from our nationalist, identity perspective, Ramaswamy has a, very, strong message. He is extremely strong on affirmative action and these diversity, equity, inclusion policies. And he's taking, he wants to take a hammer to the civil rights regime, and even is pointing out anti-white racism. Last week, he highlighted this video of this black guy, harassing this white family on a train. And he's like talking about how like this kid, our education system is teaching this anti-white racism. He's even willing to call out anti-white racism, which most people aren't. Now, this is part of his maybe just being a ambitious Indian presidential candidate, but he is saying what a lot of people want to be said, and he's able to convey that much more effectively than other candidates because he's got a little bit of charisma. The main problem with him is that he wants more Viveks in this country. I mean, he's very open about this. So that's like his main problem. So I don't know if he'd ever support him, but I think if, the chance of, compared to other candidates, who've gotten in, he's more likely to receive Trump support. It's like the only way to win this race is if you get in, you're supportive of Trump, you talk about all the great things he did, maybe you talk about how maybe there needs to be some new leadership or new ideas, but you stand with him against his legal troubles and his other obstacles that he has, and you always sound like a Trump supporter, and that, if his legal troubles get too much and he drops out, he's willing to support your candidacy. DeSantis does not have that. So I don't know how DeSantis is going to get the nomination, because even if Trump is not going to disappear from the political scene. Trump is going to be a factor in 2024 race, even if he's not the nominee. That's just it. And if that person cannot count on Trump support or an enthusiastic support even of that, that person's not going to win the election. There's a lot of problems for Republicans going into 2024 besides Trump, which they all want to think it's just Trump. There's a lot of other issues that are there for the Republican Party besides, who they all want to blame for the midterms. And I've gone over this before. I mean, there's issues about some of the social issues that they're highlighting. And unfortunately, the American public is much more libtard on these social issues. There's going to be a problem of charisma or this message, carrying forth to the rest of the population. There's also going to be issues about turning out the rural Trump base without Trump in the picture, or, maybe they've alienated Trump. So there's a lot of factors that are going to hurt Republican no matter who the candidate is. But they have to realize that Trump's going to be a factor. They can't just passively aggressive, that's not even passively aggressive, but just shriek about Trump 24/7. And hopefully Trump says I surrender. I'm giving in to the new America First movement that is totally anti-Trump and is now allied with National Review and David Frum or all these other people who are pro DeSantis. That's not going to work. That's not going to be how people imagine it is. So, in conclusions for this, I think DeSantis is under no circumstance I'm more likely to agree that DeSantis will never get the nomination in 2024 at least. He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the dynamism to seal the nomination. Even if Trump dropped out, I think DeSantis would have trouble going up against the rest of the field. And I think especially, unless there's he does a 180 and starts, winning over Trump's admiration back, which is unlikely to happen, DeSantis is not going to get the nomination. And the second thing is Trump is going to be a factor for this election, no matter whether he's in the race or not. And, if he's not in the race, Republicans are going to have to campaign on how they're going to pardon him to get his support, and then Democrats are going to bring that up. Trump is going to be a major factor in this race. They cannot get rid of Trump this election cycle. They just have to accept it. They can't, no matter how much they complain and do National Review issues about him, he's not going to go away. He's going to be there for a while. And that's just something they have to accept. And, that's the two main conclusions I have for this. But the third one is really for the right, despite any problems or flaws you may see with Trump's last candidacy, his last presidential administration, he is still our guy. He is still the only hope we have to advance our issues at the national political stage. And if he did win a second term, that would be a massive, massive victory, because that would be a defeat for the deep state, mainstream media, all these liberals, the never Trumpers, the conservative establishment, all of them would suffer a humiliating defeat. It would be even a sweeter victory than his 2016 win. And that pushes a lot of our interests further. And it creates a positive feeling among us that we can actually change the world and we can actually change this country. We can actually achieve victories. Now, you just have to be a little bit more realistic about what Trump can do. Can Trump just like throw all liberals in prison camps and deport every other leftist he can throws into the prison camp? Probably can't do that. But can he advance things? Can he reduce immigration? From an executive perspective, from the executive branch? Yes, he can. Can he advance good bills? Yes, he can. Can he, staff the judiciary with people who agree with him and have strong right-wing views? Yes, he can. You just have to be a little bit more realistic about what he can do than we were last time. And I think a lot of the problems, personnel and other things, I think that'll be solved for a second term. And it will be a bigger blow for the left-wing establishment and for the globalist American empire if he wins. And I think he will be more interested in taking on the bureaucratic state. I mean, it's very tough for that to do it. I don't think DeSantis is that interested in it at all. And a lot of what DeSantis does is these like PR victories that conservative media salivates over, and then they're no real victory at all. It's like we defeated wokeness, and it's like Disneyland is having a whole gay pride event, and a mass gay marriage ceremony. And it's like, well, it does not look like woke went to die in Florida. So Trump is the right's best hope in 2024, likely the best hope for a long time, and not supporting him is self-defeating, and wanting to pick DeSantis or not voting at all is just a way of ensuring that your views are marginalized and are not going to be debated in the mainstream and not advanced in the political discourse. And so I don't really have any time for that stuff. Yeah, it's like, if people want to talk about like what can we look forward to, what can we work for, and it's like, yeah, here's something, Trump 24. It's much more realistic than these secessionist fantasies or the not voting option, which people just think that like if you don't vote, like the globalists are like, help, we need to order a drone strike. We found a guy who's not going to vote. He's instead just going to bet on FanDuel. They don't give a shit if you don't vote. Like, they probably prefer that. It's like voting doesn't take much effort or time. It's just 5 minutes. You can do other things and still vote at the same time. And if you want to look for a project for the right to focus on for right now, it's Trump 24. Some people may not like that, but let's be real. This is what's before us. This is what pragmatic. This is something that can be accomplished much more so than any of the fantasies people banner around on Twitter or 24/7. So that's my concluding thoughts on the race. Went for a while on that, but we've got another topic to discuss right after that. So this topic we're going to discuss is the proposed TikTok ban and what that means and why there's so much universal political support for it, or apparent universal political support for it. So last week, for most of those people who were watching, there was a contentious hearing where, both Republicans and Democrats laid into TikTok for, they had their executives before there, and they were, wondering about the dangerous effects of TikTok and its connections to China and how, it's a negative force in politics. And there's a lot of support for this. It's one of the few things that you can see bipartisan support for. The only person who's like standing with TikTok is Jamal Bowman, who is like a squad member, who is simply just saying, yo, it's racist. It's like, these Republicans, the reason why they want to ban TikTok, they ain't got no swag. And it's maybe true, but I guess that's an interesting political argument to make, is they ain't got no swag. And so Bowman is literally the only guy. I mean, there's a few other Democrats who are more critical of this because they realize that it's a good political tool for them. But those who are close to the national security state are very much anti-TikTok. And there's tons of people who are anti-TikTok on the other side. I mean, this is something the national security state is opposed to TikTok. It does not like TikTok at all. It does view them as a Chinese intelligence op, and it wants it eliminated from the public. And the national security state is very much hostile to China. But there are other interests that are not as hostile to China, but those aren't have as much political clout. And it's not only the national security state, it's also big tech wants TikTok banned because all of Silicon Valley views TikTok as a threat to its interests. So it's also pushing for a TikTok ban. So both these powerful forces are there supporting a TikTok ban. And who is opposed to a TikTok ban? Just TikTok And Zoomers, like the majority of Zoomers don't have much political representation, probably fortunately. So their voices are not getting heard. But it is one thing where it's like a very powerful institutions are opposed to something or want something, but the masses are likely opposed to that measure, but there's not quite a lobby for them. Maybe you could say this is similar to immigration or other things, but I don't want to compare that to something that's positive. I don't think there are negatives to keeping TikTok around. I think there are social effects. I think the way that it's ruining the attention spans of children and introducing them to a bunch of strange shit is probably not good. I mean, there's a problem with all social media platforms. I don't think TikTok may not be the most pernicious, but it's the most popular. So it becomes the scapegoat for all the other social media else. And so a lot of people are they're strongly attacking TikTok and its influence over youth culture. There's pros and cons. I think there were more pros to make back in 2020 when it was a little less censorious than other social media platforms. And there seemed to be a chance where there was a lot of viral right-wing content would go, gain an audience on there that it wouldn't. But the right doesn't use TikTok. I mean, because they view it as as CCP controlled. So the right's not really that big on TikTok, at least compared to the left. While the left is all over it, and they're influencing, millions of kids through TikTok. Which is a problem. So maybe it is probably good that TikTok is getting banned. And libs of TikTok has shown a ton of horrible stuff from there. It's like even teachers or just viral content of just like, oh, my pronouns and my gender identity is this. And that is what it is. But I think regardless of a ban of some sorts, I guess I would support a ban. Not fully. I mean, because I just view that it supports interests of other things that are also negative. Like the people that are pushing this are also negative. Like big tech is bad. The national security state is bad. So it does further their interests. And there is a problem with one of the bills that is wanting to ban it that has been pointing out is the Restrict Act. And the Restrict Act would give the government a lot of power to go after any platform it deems a threat to national security or even individuals it deems as a threat to national security, and allows the government to censor a lot of information and content on the internet, which, that could open a Pandora's box that I don't think we want to open. I strongly oppose government censorship, and I think that what could be gained by banning TikTok, we may lose more by giving, liberal bureaucrats this power over what the content we view and the information we learn from with the internet. So I'm a bit skeptical, but, just a generic, straight TikTok ban, no Restrict Act involved, like just saying like it's done. TikTok, we're not going to allow TikTok. I would more just so because it's happening. I would want to see what the effect it would be on Zoomers. I don't know if it would be good or bad, but it would be an interesting happening. And I don't think TikTok. I think on the scale, if you're having scales of whether TikTok is good or bad, it's bad. But the same could be applied to all their social media. So for that alone, I would say that, and I would like to see the effects of it. But there are some interesting angles from this that I want to explore around the TikTok ban and what it means for politics, and particularly how it views with China. I think the one wrong thing that we need to get out of our minds is that conservatives are saying the CCP is intentionally promoting all this weird stuff to America, and the Chi-coms are behind this. And that is false. Like, the reason why TikTok is bad is because of the Americans who are on it, or using it, or promoting the content. It is trying to blame the CCP for spreading this content, but it really is just something internal. It is a part of our culture, and our culture is reflected by TikTok. It is not the CCP imposing a false culture on our youth. It's the youth showcasing their culture through this medium. I mean, if you want to see, youth culture displayed. You can watch Euphoria on HBO. I don't think the CCP wrote the scripts for Euphoria, but you can see stuff like the themes and attitudes and beliefs reflected in Euphoria. You can see that all the time in TikTok, and it's not that TikTok or the CCP is like, oh, the Americans, we promote gender pronouns. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, hurt, CCP rules. It's not like they're putting out like CCP awesome videos. They're not putting that stuff out. And China is not that appealing of a superpower to other people, at least compared to even with like superpowers in the past or like enemies of America, something like the Soviet Union. Prior to the Cold War, the Soviet Union had a lot of appeal to a large number of Americans, because it's all like, wow, they're achieving equality, economic equality. Look at all the great things they're doing, and this is something that America can emulate. And even a lot of liberals were into this stuff. And even a little bit into the Cold War, Soviet Union had some attraction to people, but it's like China doesn't really have that. China, it's a bland government ran by a bunch of geriatric men who don't really understand like how to pitch China to the world. They really haven't figured out the effective message for China to reach the rest of the world. I do think they're going to lean onto this anti-white, third world message, anti-colonial message, and they are promoting that heavily. But even when it comes to TikTok, those messages are not originating from some Chi-Com official. Those are originating from within America. Chi-Coms did not get control of American universities to make them anti-white. The people there made them anti-white on their own, independently of the Chi-Coms. But it's easier to blame a foreign power for this, and I think that's part of the appeal, not just in the CCP bashing, but also in the obsession with Klaus Schwab and the WEF. As I wrote in my article about Klaus Schwab, I think it's now like 2 months ago, it was like back in January, they view Schwab as the ultimate enemy, the villain, because it's easier to blame Schwab as this like James Bond-like villain, this globalist villain. It's easier to see him as responsible for our ills or for pushing a lot of the negative things we see around the world than to see this coming from within us, and to see that it's other Americans, fellow Americans who are doing this, and even it's coming from our government or our powerful institutions. It's a lot simpler and a lot easier to believe, and a lot more comforting to believe, to see this as a foreign power. I think it's like going along with Trump's statement. I think that Trump's statement, that our real enemy isn't Russia or China, it's the people who lead this country, is a very powerful statement. It's a very truthful statement from our perspective, from a right-wing perspective. And, Trump is one of the few leaders out there who is promoting that message. So I think it's very important that he's getting out there. And that's what's true. And it goes along with the CCP. And I think CCP is a more mainstream conservative position, and you see this a lot. The CCP is promoting wokeness, the CCP is promoting Black Lives Matter, all this stuff. I mean, it is true. For those who think that like base China, there's not that many of those out there, but there's still a few people like that. China supports all this woke shit. They support anti-white racism. They're like, even what they're promoting on the global stage, whenever they confront America, they're like, America is white supremacist power. We, China, oppose white supremacy. And so they do that all the time. And they always confront America about systemic racism. And they don't really do it in a smart way. I remember when they had Black Lives Matter messaging back in the summer of Floyd. The messaging included all lives matter, which they didn't get the memo. We are fortunate that China doesn't really understand our domestic political situation. The Soviets had a better grasp of a domestic American politics, or were able to have more domestic allies, even at the height of the Cold War, than the Chinas are. I mean, Chi-Coms are. And China just has a massive amount of economic influence over our country. And that's why people are nicer to China, just for monetary and profit reasons. It's like why Hollywood and a lot of these financial people and businesses and big tech have a friendlier attitude towards China, is because they just want to make money there. There's no ideological predisposition towards China. Outside of just saying it's a non-white power, and during the COVID thing, it's like, oh, it's racist to blame China. Or even what Bowman's saying is like, it's racist to want to ban TikTok. But I think it is wrong to place these issues on China. I don't think it's as bad as with Schwab, because China is an actual problem, while Schwab is just like a goofball. I think people overstate his power and influence. China does have a lot of power and influence, and they are a negative force in the world, and I do not want to live in a world dominated by China. So I don't mind it as much, but I don't think it's as truthful to blame the Chi-coms for everything wrong in America. I mean, it's really, this stuff comes from internally. And when we're blaming all this content we're seeing on TikTok and like, oh, this is so bad, and then we ban TikTok and we're going to have less of the woke stuff, they'll just, big tech, Silicon Valley, that is wanting this TikTok ban will just come up with its own alternative to TikTok. And then you'll see the same exact content that conservatives hate on TikTok on that platform. And there's already some other platforms that are emerging that are gaining a lot more, or gaining some of the people away from youth. I mean, even if you look at some of the terrible things that are happening, I mean, are terrible platforms. I mean, you got like Twitch, it's like extremely left wing. Discord, even though I know a lot of people, a lot of people use Discord, and I might as well. Not heavily, because I don't play video games that much, but I know a lot of right wingers are into Discord and the messaging. But teenagers getting into Discord, that's where a lot of the grooming happens that people discuss. So I mean, and these are not coming from the Chi-coms, so that's just something to keep in mind. I don't mind it. As I said previously, I don't oppose this as much as blaming Klaus Schwab and WEF. I don't think it's as stupid. And I do think you are at least attacking a real threat. But if we're wanting to be honest about the situation, this stuff is coming from America itself. And it's coming from the American culture and what we produce now. And I think it's just convenient to just blame a foreign power for it. And all these conservatives are into it. And the other interesting thing is opposition towards China is one of the few unifying aspects of American life and American politics now. There's still some Democrats who are opposed to a more, hawkish position towards China. But I think those people are more of a minority. If you look at the leadership, if you look at Biden, look at Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, Menendez, all of those guys are very, hostile to China. And the entire Republican Party is as well. I mean, I don't know if there's any pro-China person within conservative media or the Republican Party. They all hate the CCP. And so it does create the conditions for a type of Cold War. I don't think we would have the type of Cold War with the Soviet Union, because the amount of economic interdependence between China and the United States is just something that could never have been thought of with us in the Soviet Union. There's that factor. Even though a lot of people are pushing for that interdependence to be weakened, that's a major push for bringing a lot of these manufacturing jobs back to America, or shifting them to China or to India or somewhere else in the world. And also, Biden still maintains a lot of these tariffs on China to maintain, and they're wanting to weaken China. There is this fear over Chinese power that is shared by, a lot of the elite institutions, with the exceptions of the entertainment industry, the NBA, and some of the financial markets, and the financial industry. But the national security state, the, political establishment, and even though big tech wants to ban TikTok, there is some elements in big tech world that are very hostile to China, probably even more so than some in the financial sector. And the general public doesn't like China. And also the national security state is using the lab leak hypothesis, which is probably true. I don't doubt it. And, but they're using to promote that idea now because they want, greater public support for this hostile position in China. Now, I don't view it as a negative that we're hostile to China, because as I said before, I keep saying, I do view China as a real problem in the world. I do view them as a threat to Western civilization, and I don't want to live in a world dominated by China. But at the same time, I do have worries about that, is that we could use this hostility towards China, this anti China sentiment, to unify support for the globalist American empire's agenda and to use that to make conservatives accept a lot of the changes that are around them and to say, like, we need these changes in order to beat China. And I do worry that, with bringing a lot of some of the manufacturing back, is that we no longer have that type of working class that we did when they shipped off manufacturing 40 years ago, and that they'll just import workers here, and so it'll lead to increased immigration here. And I do worry that, like, they'll now pitch mass immigration as something that, oh, we just needed this for our economy, and America as a nation of immigrants, is that we need more immigration to beat the Chi-Coms. And they could use that for other things. They could say, like, well, we need to do reparations to show how we're better than the Chi-Coms, which oppress their minority groups. Instead, we give $1 million to our oppressed minority groups. And so they could make these arguments that advance left-wing interests, and they'll pitch it to conservatives as saying that this is a way to beat back the Chi-Coms. This is a way to defeat them and to suppress their influence. And I do think this is a possibility. I mean, we did this in the Cold War. I mean, they were able to achieve integration by saying, look, we're in a war with the Soviets, and they're saying that they're the true egalitarian power in the world, and they stand up for real liberty and equality. And the only way we can help ourselves, pitching ourselves to the third world, is if we achieve integration. And so that's a big reason why integration happened. I mean, the Department of Justice, in its briefs given to the Supreme Court in support of the eventual affirmative decision in Brown v. Board of Education and overturned segregation in schools, it said that this is a national security matter, that we have to do this to make America stronger and to help our cause, the cause of freedom around the world. And that was, in a lot of Supreme Court justices found that an appealing argument, and so did a lot of Americans. And so it was able to, by having this foreign threat, it was able to advance progressive ideas in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, if we didn't have Soviet Union as an enemy, they would have had a much tougher time pitching, integration and other things, other factors in the matter, and also just like the support for decolonization as well. Which that wasn't general public, but I mean, America felt that it had to be on the side of decolonizers due to Soviet influence. That was more of an elite level, but you could see the same thing happen here in America, and we will, instead of just seeing the Chinese as this alien Han population with these bizarre customs and villainous attitudes, we'll just see them as like they stand for autocracy. They don't have gay marriage. I don't know if they do have gay marriage. They ban pit bulls, so they'll be like, oh, they're so evil. They ban pit bulls. While here in America, we allow as many pit bulls as possible. And in China, they restrict trans surgery, and so while we have unlimited trans surgeries, and so they'll try to pitch us as like the more tolerant and equal nation and more freedom and all this type of stuff as a way to really stick it to the Chi-Coms. And I do worry about that prospect. That is a real negative. I mean, nations do need great enemies to set themselves apart from and to define themselves. And I think that America became worse, at least on the global stage, when it no longer had the Soviet Union around, and it made America like, oh, we can, invade any country we want and turn it into democracy and no one can stop us. Which, having the Soviet Union there, made people like say like, oh, well, we can't do this. There's another great power there and we have to work within our limits. And it also just made people hostile to communism and seeing as there's like a global enemy. I think by the time of there is both a right-wing and a left-wing push, or that both right-wing and left-wing were helped in different matters by the Cold War. But there's a potential that like a Cold War against China could help the right if it allows us to push for restricting Chinese immigration. It allows us to push, even bringing back some of the manufacturing here would be good. and supporting American economy. There's another problem there with it comes with. I don't know if we have quite the human capital that we did back in 40, 50 years ago before outsourcing. And I'm worried that may just increase immigration, but that's a topic for another day. I need to explore that topic a little bit more. But it could also just create this impression that we are in a war against this power that's anti-white, it's both non-white and anti-white, and that could make Americans understand their fundamental identity and create a group consciousness among the founding stock of America, the core demographic of America. So there are some positive things that could happen, but I do worry that it'll just create more support for the gay and persuade conservatives to support a lot of gay agenda items and just the pursuit of owning the Chi-Coms. So it's a bit of a complicated measure. But I do think the TikTok thing, that does show the power of hostility towards China, about how it's one of the few unifying factors in both political parties. You don't see any opposition for Republicans or conservatives, who usually are the most skeptical of any type of bipartisan efforts. But the entire Republican conservative apparatus is fully behind this. And it probably is a good thing. I don't know if it'll solve the problem. As I said, I think big tech, Silicon Valley, will just come up with its own alternative, and you'll see the same type of crazy content, and there'll be no way for America to restrict that, unlike with TikTok. And I'm also worried that it may give the national security state or liberal bureaucrats of the government more control over free speech in this country, especially on the internet. And I do think it's misplaced and convenient, but convenient for Republicans to blame wokeness and the spread of it on the Chi-Coms rather than looking at the actual sources of it, which is within us, within this country. So those are my thoughts on it. It'll be interesting to see. I would have never thought they would have banned TikTok a few years ago, or just even last year, because I was like, they're going to alienate young voters. Like, this is actually going to turn all these apolitical kids into really, that'll really make them mad. It'll be a happening if it does occur. They'll just have to have an alternative in place to calm down their fears. Maybe you might see a Zoomer revolt or riots over TikTok. That's one reason I support it. Is just what will happen to the public? It's something that'll shock the public, and to see how the public responds will be interesting, and maybe it could push things forward by doing so. But it's the fact that it's bipartisan probably will negate any political effect. I don't know. Maybe I don't think it'll make them more Democrat. And Republicans already have a problem among young people, and any young person who's already voting Republican is probably not going to change their attitude because of TikTok. They're not going to switch over to Democrat. There's not that many young people who are voting Republican, but it'll be interesting to see how Zoomers react. It could be like the even bigger than Roe v. Wade. It could activate a bunch of young people to vote. I don't know who they vote for in 2024. Maybe if Trump promises to bring back TikTok, he'll win an unprecedented amount of the Zoomer vote in 2024. So maybe it could create openings there. But we'll keep tuned. I actually do think it's likely that it'll get banned, because there's no powerful influence standing up for TikTok except for Zoomers, except for the majority of Zoomers. Every other industry, if big tech and the national security state and the GOP and a lot of the Democratic leadership and Biden are in agreement about something, it's likely going to happen. I don't see what could stop this besides, Zoomers having their own J6 of the Capitol and them of being afraid about being tossed out of office by these mulatto perm kids who are demanding their TikTok. Oh, bro, you can't do that. So it'll be interesting to watch, and we'll keep notice of it. But for my opinion on it, it does look like Congress is going to do some type of restriction on TikTok, and it'll be an unprecedented move, and it'll be some type of happening. Now on to our Cognitive Elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at highly respected Substack, and that's at highly respected.substack.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ Summits while you're there if you haven't already, even though I know a lot of the true fans have already done that. The first question comes from New England Refugee. And as I say, if you want to ask as many questions as you want, you can. And there's been both the people asking questions know to always get a question in every week. And you can be a part of that crew if you sign up for the Con Elite option. So New England Refugee asks, have been seeing people on our side saying Tucker is no longer supporting Trump? These texts that were released showed he at one point did have mixed feelings. How do you think Tucker feels about Trump? And I talked a little bit about this earlier on in the show. And Tucker's feelings on Trump, I think most of those texts came out around the end of the election, the last election, and after January 6th. And people were just like, Trump is done. Even I was a little bit on like, this is finally what finished Trump. And of course, that did not finish Trump. I mean, nothing has finished Trump. Like, any time that people are like, Trump is finished, he comes back. I mean, midterms looked like Trump, things didn't look good for Trump. Now Trump's back and in high energy. He's back in his old self again. And he is certainly not done. But like, people at that time were soured on Trump, and they're like, we really need to move beyond. Like, January 6th is so bad for him that, we'll have to look for other candidates. And I think that influenced a lot of Tucker's feelings on Trump at that time. And why I said, it's saying this in personal text messages. People say a lot of things in personal text messages, but what's really important is what he says publicly. And publicly, he stands pro-Trump. He says he loves Trump. He's always sticking up with him. He may have, he does have private qualms about Trump. And so do a lot of people have private qualms about Trump, especially if they personally interact with him. But I think that they are well aware that there is no real alternative to Trump, and he's the best hope we have. And I think Tucker understands that and knows that despite his own personal issues with Trump, he is accepting Trump, that he's probably the best choice for 2024. There's no other option. I think if you had asked him, if you had asked me in 2021, I would have said that like Tucker definitely does not like Trump, and he wants someone else to run. He is not interested in another Trump run, but I think his views have changed. And I think he's looked at the field of candidates and realizes that there's no one better. And I think he was very much not happy with DeSantis's flip-flopping on Ukraine. He even subtly alluded that in an episode last week, saying you can't trust any of these candidates who change their mind on it. And that was clearly a reference to DeSantis, even though the DeSantis stands don't want to admit that. It's like, he must have been talking about Trump. But yeah, I think so. I think that's what I think. He mixed feelings, I would say, but I think he's going to be supporting, compared to the other candidates. I think Tucker feels that Trump is probably the best. That's just my own read on it. I can't speak for him personally, but that is my view on that. So that's the first question. The second question comes from Jay. Always make sure to ask a question, which is great. And he brought up the last week's episode where we were talking about the Iraq War and neocon era. And he says, I have a question about a related topic, Tony Blair. My understanding is that Tony Blair controls a lot of NGOs that have influence in Africa, maybe starting to be in Asia too. And when you hear about Bill Gates donating money, it's really Tony Blair NGOs he's giving money to. These NGOs basically write policy papers and encourage politicians to adopt them. Here's my question. When all these billionaires are donating their money, are they really just going into political NGOs? If so, what are the relevant NGOs that are influencing U.S. politics? Is Tony one of them? I think there's a lot of different NGOs. It's hard to say which specific ones. Clearly anything that's getting money from George Soros is affecting American politics. I don't know how much. Tony Blair seems to be more of an international level of NGOs. But if you're talking about direct domestic influence and NGOs, with that, it really is Soros that is there. And now everyone talks about this conspiracy theory, and conservatives say this is a little bit. So it's not that revelatory for a lot of these people. But Soros is having a major impact on his money. The fact that he's putting in all these DAs throughout this country, and that they're having a major influence both with Alvin Bragg in New York and elsewhere. He's got DAs in St. Louis, Philadelphia, Chicago. Some of them lost their elections, but I know Philadelphia, Chicago. I think Atlanta, he has one. They're all over the place. He's got to have he's at least about a dozen major cities have a Soros DA, and so those type of NGOs do have that influence. And it's more, I don't know if it would be properly seen as the necessary NGOs, but these, I mean, there are non-government entities, they are nonprofits, or they're political action groups, and they are contributing a bunch of money to these initiatives. And it can also be seen in some of the NGOs that are providing a lot of the educational material. So I think for when it comes to America, it's more Soros than Blair. The Blair thing, that would be require a little bit more of an investment. Blair is terrible. I mean, Blair left office and he's still been relevant to British politics due to his massive NGO influence that he has. And it is generally, he's always promoting, he never recanted from his support for the Iraq War, or at least to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't. And he's always supporting foreign interventions all over the place and more immigration and all these terrible stuff. Blair is quite awful, to put it succinctly. So yeah, there is something to be done about these NGOs. It is a massive problem for America that just 1 billion or a couple, and they always complain about the Kochs, and it's like the Kochs have nowhere near the amount of influence as these liberal NGOs over American policy, about the people pushing these criminal justice reform, people pushing for pro-immigration policies, people pushing just these general DAs and these local judges and officials who are going to be guiding policy and guiding how a city is run or even a state is run. They're really putting a lot of money into this. I even was seeing this new effort the Democrats are doing. It's maybe not quite as an NGO, but it is something that is maybe off the beaten path of how they're trying to influence the way this country's run, is that they're investing a ton of money. I saw $60 million into this effort to take over state legislatures. And conservatives have done actually pretty well in state legislatures. I mean, there's a lot of deep red legislatures now, and that's why they're pushing a lot of these more radical ideas, or ideas that would have been more radical just a year ago, such as banning transgender surgeries for kids, pushing even more effective critical race theory bans, or even what Texas is doing. Texas is trying to pass bills to give Texas the power to enforce immigration law, which that'll be a big deal if that happens. I'm very much optimistic about those chances. I hope it passes. I think that would be a very good event if that happened, and I think it's something that it would definitely go to the Supreme Court, and I think the Supreme Court may rule in its favor. Arizona did something similar to that in 2010 with SB 1070, and the Supreme Court, kind of neutered it, but the Supreme Court now has a much better lineup to hear these issues and hear these questions. So there could be something interesting there. As the state legislatures are becoming more conservative, but Democrats are realizing that, and they're trying to have more Democrat takeover. And I think this could already be seen in some of these battleground states that are happening, or states that were once, had Republican legislatures like Virginia and elsewhere, and they could make them far more left-leaning. And, that creates huge problems with, that first off, they can lead into more of these loose election laws that allow them to do more ballot harvesting and to, make sure elections go their way and all these other matters. And so you have to keep track of some of the efforts that are happening. And it's not just, the presidential campaign or the Senate campaign. There's a lot of things happening on the lower level. And Democrats, I don't know what type of NGO influence is going into that state legislatures, but there's obviously a lot of NGO influence going into these district attorney races, which it's really the way to counter that is Republicans have to get involved in that. And I think it's hard for the cities because cities are overwhelmingly Democrat. The only Democrats can win. So you have to back, just the moderate Democrat. But I think the results, you'd much rather have a moderate Democrat who will actually do something about crime than, a Soros DA. So that's something interesting, something to look forward to come back to. Maybe looking into other NGOs on that, but that's what's on top of my mind for that question. So that is it for Highly Respected today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you guys are now pumped for Trump 2024, even more so than before. And so we're going to have another incredible IQ supplement later this week. So tune in for that, and another great, highly respected next week, next Monday at its ordinary time. And so be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.